life. Like I always knew I was going to be a mom. I always knew I was going to get married. I always knew for some reason I was going to have a really good marriage. But I also knew that we were going to go through something very difficult, but it was going to be okay. I don't know how to explain this, but ever since I was little, I just knew these things to be true. And I told my husband this when we were dating, like, hey, we're gonna have a great marriage, but we're gonna go through something really, really hard. And so kind of, my whole life, I was just kind of thinking like, what is this gonna be? Like, what is God gonna ask of me? And I think that's like really the gist of my story today is, are we fully open to God's plan for our lives and trusting that his plan is better than our plan?
Are you walking through a storm that feels like it will never end? Do you wonder if life's storms have stolen the beauty from your life for good? You're in the right place. My name is Heather, and like you, I've been through a storm or two and wondered if life would ever be beautiful again. Here we share warriors' words, stories of discovering beauty after battles, and the worth in your wounds. Pick up your sword or boxing gloves and join the battle. Your words are powerful, my friends. Make them warrior words. Welcome, warriors. Gina Morton is a professional declutter coach and podcast host of the 2.5% globally ranked podcast, Pruning to Prosper. It is Gina's desire to help Catholic moms run their homes smoothly so they have more space to hear and do what God is calling them to do. She helps women prune away the earthly barriers to prosper into the women God is calling them to be. Gina is a Catholic wife and mom of 4 living children and 1 deceased child. She is a Scouts BSA Scoutmaster in a female troop, philanthropist, and cheerleader to all. She and her family reside in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. Now, before we hear from Gina, have you left a review for the show? It's easy and quick. Go to Apple Podcast and scroll to the bottom section called Ratings and Reviews. Give a star rating, add a title and a sentence or two, and then click Submit. Who knows? I just might read your review next. And have you joined the Facebook group? After you leave your review, come join us in the Warrior Words Facebook community at facebook.com/groups/warrior words. This community was made for women like you and me who sometimes struggle with new traumas or in how to find beauty in life's situations. So let's support and encourage one another in our struggles. Ultimately, learning to find beauty in even the toughest of situations. Now, grab a tissue and join Gina and me as we talk about how important it is to be open to God's will when walking through storms. Let's rock. Well, hi, Gina. Welcome to the Warrior Words podcast.
Hi, Heather. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate your time, and I'm so glad we get to sit down and chat. So you and I were talking a little bit before I hit record, and we were talking about your pregnancy and back in 2008 when you found out you were pregnant. So can you share a little bit about your pregnancy journey with us?
Yeah. So I was married for quite a few years at the time. We got married in 2003 and we had our first son. His name is Charlie. We had him in 2006 and I always babysat boys. So I really wanted to be a boy mom. 2 boys was always my dream. So when I found out I was pregnant in 2008, it was the year of St. Paul. The Catholic Church was celebrating St. Paul. And I remember just being in my backyard and I was gardening and I thought, God, if you give me a son, I will name him Paul. And that was just my little prayer in the backyard. And fast forward to December of 2008, he came in the 3rd week of Advent. So it was the week of the Gaudete Sunday. And he wasn't quite full term, but he was the first day that he could be considered like full term. You know what I mean? Like it was 37 weeks, I think he was born. And it was fast and furious. It was 10 o'clock at night on December 15th, 2008. And I said to my husband, we have to go to the hospital. And my neighbor came to watch my older son while my parents drove up. They live about 45 minutes away. And I got to the hospital, and thank God another woman was already there because my midwife was already there. So there's some woman out there that has a baby born on the same day that I am forever grateful for because my midwife was already there at the hospital. And 7 minutes later, I was the
Wow.
mom of two boys. So we named him Theodore Paul uh, to, keep my promise to God of
Yeah.
naming him after St. Paul. However, when he was born, he presented with what they call a blueberry muffin rash. So head to toe, black and blue marks. So they whisked him off to the NICU, which is the neonatal intensive care unit, if
Yeah.
anyone is, make sure we all know. And that was that. I didn't see him then for a few hours. But I'll back up to when I was a child. And I don't know what it's called, but I do believe that God places a few things on our hearts, like that you just are so ingrained in who you are that you just know, like, oh, this is part of my life. Like I always knew I was going to be a mom. I always knew I was going to get married. I always knew for some reason I was going to have a really good marriage. But I also knew that we were going to go through something very difficult, but it was going to be okay. I don't know how to explain this, but ever since I was little, I just knew these things to be true. And I told my husband this when we were dating, like, hey, we're gonna have a great marriage, but we're gonna go through something really, really hard. And so kind of, my whole life, I was just kind of thinking like, what is this gonna be? Like, what is God gonna ask of me? And I think that's like really the gist of my story today is, are we fully open to God's plan for our lives and trusting that his plan is better than our plan?
That's
So,
the hard part. Yes.
so that night we went up to the NICU. They wheeled me up in the wheelchair and we entered the room, and there was a huge semicircle of professionals, doctors, nurse practitioners, all these professionals. And I'm just sitting in the middle in my wheelchair with my husband beside me. And the one doctor said, your son's white blood cell count is very high, which means his little body is fighting something. And in fact, it's the highest we've ever seen. But we just don't know what it is. And I said, isn't that a sign of cancer? And it was silent. And I just felt like I knew whatever God had placed on my heart as a little kid, that it had begun. And I didn't know how it was going to unfold. I didn't know what I was going to have to do, but I was like, okay, it's go time. And so the next day or two, a doctor came into my room and he did say, it is cancer. And so my son was born with acute myeloid leukemia, AML, and he was the 31st documented case ever. So of the 30 babies that came before him, 15 lived and 15 died. So he was going to tip the scales one way or the other. So the doctor said, we can't treat him here at our local hospital. He says, you're going to have to be transferred to a different hospital. I need you to go home, pack a bag. And a specialized ambulance was coming from the other hospital. It was Hershey Medical Center, like Hershey the chocolate. That's exactly where we were. It was Hershey, Pennsylvania. So a specialized ambulance had to drive from Hershey to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where we live, to pick up my son. So in that time, we got to go home and pack a bag. And I just really had no clue about cancer. Like, even though people with cancer, my mom had gone through cancer, like, but you still are just, plus I just had a baby, so it's like your whole world is upside down. I have a toddler. So I'm like, I have an hour to go home and figure out my whole life. And my mother-in-law was
Wow. Yeah.
there. So I was like, can you just stay and watch Charlie? I packed a bag. We went back to the hospital and then we were transferred to Hershey Medical Center. And so yeah, so that's where we were. And I'll tell you, okay, so this is a little aside of the story, but I think when we trust in God's plan, we also have to trust that He has worked out every detail. Like He knows our every worry. And so I was a stay-at-home mom and we were barely scraping by. My husband was new in his industry and like he just wasn't making a lot of money. So like every
Right.
dime was
Yeah.
accounted for. So for us to be transferred out to Hershey, I was like, well, where are we going to stay? Are we going to get a hotel? Like we can't, that's not sustainable to
Hmm.
stay in a hotel. So this nurse, she said to me, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to cry because
That's okay.
if any of your listeners have ever stayed at a Ronald McDonald House, they are the greatest things in the world. So this nurse said, um, she's like, there's a Ronald McDonald House, and I think you should call them. And me on my high horse said, well, we have insurance. That's not for people like me. And she's like, I think you should call. And I was like, okay, thank God. So I was humbled right off the bat. You're just like,
Yeah.
this is like totally out of my control. God's got it. Close your mouth, girl, and just go with the flow. So we go.
Yes.
So anyway, at the time, now remember this is 2008, there were a little over 300 Ronald McDonald houses in the world, and only 3 of them were completely free to their guests. And Hershey is one of them. So we got totally free room and board. It was wonderful because that's a major stress. So
Oh, yeah.
when like there's very practical things when you're doing God's will. And one of them is, how are we going to support ourselves?
Yeah.
So one big worry was already off the table. So then we get settled into the hospital and we learn the routine. And if you have any Penn State alumni listening to your podcast,
My sister is a Penn Stater. Yes.
you're kidding.
No, no, she's.
So, okay, so I don't know if your sister knows about Thon, but it's a dance marathon that Penn State puts on, and all the money raised during this 3-day weekend and throughout the year, they do other fundraisers. All that money raised goes to families with children undergoing cancer treatment at Hershey Medical Center. So everything my son would go through financially was covered until he was 18 years old. So we would escape from this with zero debt. And I always have to give a caveat. My insurance was great. They did cover everything. But had they not, we had this safety net of
Yeah.
it's called the Four Diamonds Fund. So we were exposed to this philanthropic endeavor. It's the largest student-run philanthropic endeavor in the world is Penn State. So it is incredible. And we got a front row seat to how it's all done. We've spoken at Thon. So it's incredible. That's just to plant the little seed for the end of the story that's coming later. So we got to witness all this, right? So Teddy, was very sick, obviously.
Right.
And they told us when he was first admitted to the hospital, they said, leukemia, cancer, it's its own beast. And most likely there'll be 2 reasons that he doesn't survive. The one is that he simply doesn't respond to the chemotherapy. And 2, he catches a cold. So,
Wow.
we had a lot of miracles, a lot of wonderful things happen. But long story short, 4 months later, he caught a cold. So actually it was 3 months. It was March like 17th. He caught a cold and he did get to come home to our house in Allentown 2 different times. So I got to have a little bit of normalcy with having my 2 boys at home. It was crazy and hectic, but we survived. And but in the end, it wasn't God's will that he beat the cancer. So we came back to Allentown and we thought, okay, God, what do you want us to do with this? And so my husband, we were so touched by the Ronald McDonald House that we thought, okay, we're going to go back to Allentown and this is going to be our cause. We're going to build a Ronald McDonald House. That was not possible. The doors were closed for that. So plan B, if we can't have a Ronald McDonald House, let's do a children's hospital. So my husband reached out to our local hospital where Teddy was born, and he said, if you're ever considering building a children's hospital, please include my wife and I in those plans. So a few years later, we got the call and they said, we want to build a children's hospital. So, and it's not that we, it's not that we funded this thing ourselves. Don't get that impression. But we got to be a big part of it, and we do support it financially. But yeah, so we now have a children's hospital here in the Lehigh Valley, and the thought was because we want quality care close to home. Because if you've ever talked to any parents that have a sick child, it's not really the sick child that is the big stress. Yes, it's very stressful.
Yes.
But oftentimes it's the healthy children that are kind of shuffled through, the siblings that are just kind of lost in the mix. That is the huge stress. You know, like my sister pretty much took my older toddler and he lived with her for a bit. He lived with me in the Ronald McDonald House. You know, like it was just, he was really my worry, was my toddler. And the days before Teddy died, I just made a decision because I thought my son was really struggling, my toddler son. And I said, you know what? He's just going to be in the hospital room with me. And by this time, Teddy was in the PICU and there was no room. It was so much equipment in that room that there really wasn't anywhere for my son, my toddler son, to take a nap. So I said to him, he turned 3 in March. And so I said to him, I said, Charlie, I said, if you want to be with mommy, you're going to have to learn to take a nap on my lap. So that very first day he did. I held him on my lap and he took a nap, and I thought, okay, this is our new normal. And, you know, at that point, Teddy was intubated. So he really didn't, I didn't get to hold him anymore. He was completely sedated. So I just thought, well, my priority has to shift to my toddler. And so if he can only hang out in the hospital for a couple of hours, that's what we're going to do. But God knew all this, and he gave me the perfect first child. Like, my Charlie is what they would call a trick baby, or what is that phrase where people like you get like a really good first kid and then you and you think, oh, I got this, like I'll have a couple more kids. So he was really like the perfect kid. Like I can't imagine living in a hospital room with any of my other kids that I've had since. But so yeah, so that's what happened. So the day before Teddy did die, my son Charlie was with me, my dad was with me, and Teddy looked pretty good. His numbers looked really good. And we thought maybe he'll come off of the oxygen, but it just was not God's will. So that night I called my husband and I said, I think you should come, because remember, my husband is trying to work and provide for our family. So he was kind of commuting as best he could.
Right.
So we're about an hour and 15 minutes from Hershey Medical Center. So my poor husband was commuting. But that particular day he had stayed. If Teddy was doing well, my husband would try to stay in Allentown. So I called my husband. I said, I think you better come. It's not looking good. And so sure enough, that, you know, April 21st, God called him home. And of course it's devastating, but the blessings and the miracles that have come from that child are just incredible. And St. Paul was known for his conversion. And I remember being in the hospital right after I had Teddy and thinking, I don't know why I got this kid, but he's going to change hearts. Like, who can't pray for a little boy born at Christmas time with cancer named Teddy? So when I say people came out and prayed for this child, people that haven't prayed in years. My husband and I were asked to be godparents to 2 little girls that came into the faith. I have not godchildren, but confirmation sponsors. Like, I think when people witness faith that they can't fathom, it brings them to Christ. And if that's what we had to go through and what Teddy had to go through to bring people to Christ, then I would do it all over again, because it was just amazing.
That is beautiful. I do like to ask about beauty
Okay.
in all of in my episodes here, and that I don't need to ask because that right there's nothing more beautiful than someone coming to know Christ and somebody deepening their faith or bringing their faith back if
Mhm.
they've strayed, and it's just beautiful.
Oh, it is.
It is.
And like, I really, I mean, it's hard to follow God's will. I
Yeah.
don't always in every area of my life follow his
No.
will, but I got to have something to work on. So, but I think like you just have to trust that your every worry and your every concern, God knows it. And so really like there's nothing to worry about ever. Like it's going to be okay. And one of my secrets is I pray the rosary. And I remember praying the rosary in the hospital. And I would always say, you get the nurse you need on the day you need her. And sometimes I would get a nurse that would pray the rosary with me. Sometimes I would get a nurse that would just quietly go about, because Teddy was always in a private room
Mhm.
because we looked like COVID before we ever knew what COVID was.
Yeah.
When he was in the NICU, my husband and I had to scrub up and down. Like our hands were bleeding by day 2 because you had to scrub all the way up to your elbows. You had to go under each fingernail, hairnet,
Mhm.
face mask, complete scrubs, including over the shoes, everything. So to get in and out of the NICU was this major ordeal. So, you know, it was just a crazy, crazy time of life, but the nurses, sometimes they would just quietly go about their day and let me pray. And then I'd have nurses that would say, like, come on, mom, like you gotta suck it up, buttercup. Like you need to be
Mhm.
strong. And I'd be like, okay, okay, I'm not gonna cry today. And I think at one point I did make a decision, like I'm gonna put on makeup. I'm gonna stop crying. Not that crying isn't good, it's fine, but I think sometimes you do have to put on the makeup and say, I got to be strong. I have to like, there's a lot to, I'm a declutter coach and I talk a lot about decluttering the wardrobe and making sure that your outfits fit, flatter, and make you feel fabulous. And I do think that how we look on the outside kind of can translate to how we feel on the inside. So I was like,
Yeah.
okay, enough wearing like frumpy pregnancy clothes, like had the baby, time to like, my mom got me some cute little not workout, but like at the time that it was like those velour tracksuits were kind of in style. Do you remember?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't I didn't have the juicy, but I like if you can remember back in 2008, it was like you just felt kind of cuter. I felt like
Mhm.
I was a little more put together. So and I don't know, but we came home and it's been 16 years and I still love to hear Teddy stories. Like I still love to hear people that are like, you're Teddy's mom? Like, oh my gosh, I remember praying for him because I was really involved with our church. So, as Catholics, we don't usually pray for each other from the pulpit. Like Catholics, it's like I don't know, we just don't really pray for each other in a way that we should be, right? And especially from the pulpit. But because I ran the youth group at that church, and the priest that I did the youth group with, he would preach about Teddy from the pulpit, and he would kind of keep the congregation up to date of like what's happening with this
Oh
baby.
yeah.
And then that priest, he also had a connection to Thon, and our next door neighbor, he was dancing at Thon that year. And so these kids from Penn State, they would go out to their hometowns and they would do what we
Mhm.
would call canning weekends, which is where they would literally have coffee cans and they would stand on the streets and raise money for cancer, for kids with cancer, right? So it was a really fun thing. We've hosted these kids in our house, all the things,
Oh
but
wow.
so our next door neighbor, Peter, he was home canning with his fraternity. So normally you are not allowed to ask for money in front of a Catholic church unless you're the Knights of Columbus or something Catholic, right?
Mhm.
But because Father Tom had this connection to Penn State, he made an announcement from the pulpit. Again, here we go with the tears. Um, he said, Peter is outside. He's home from Penn State. He's raising money for kids with cancer being treated at Hershey Medical Center. And he said Peter was an altar server. He went all through the schools. He said it's one of our own, helping one of our own. So when you go out there, He said, I want you people to open your wallets and give. And those kids raised over $1,000 in the
Wow.
5 minutes after church. Because everyone
Okay.
was so on board. And it was just like, it was just one beautiful thing after the next. Like the whole Teddy experience was just incredible. It's like, I mean, of course, we had moments that were horrible, but the overall, um, just trust that God put in us to have this child, like he said, I'm going to give you this baby and I'm going to need you to do this. And, he's a little saint. So it's good to know that I have a saint in heaven.
Oh.
So yeah, if you guys ever need intercession, Saint Teddy.
Okay. I see you at least came prepared with a tissue there
I know.
for those people who are listening instead of watching. Yeah, we're both wiping the tears from our faces. So
Yeah, it's good. It's happy tears. It really is
yeah.
happy tears. And I think like, um, it's just if you just trust what God's got in store for you, it's an incredible adventure of a life. You're never going to have a boring life if you're like every day you wake up, you say the morning offering. It's like, what are we going to do today, God? I'm here to do your will. And so, anywho, uh, to point out also that God has a sense of humor. This
She
this
does, yes.
woman, this woman that prayed for two boys in my backyard. I came home and over the course of the next few years, God gave us three daughters. So he had the last laugh for sure. So now I have this house full of girls, loud, crazy girls, which is so fun.
They are fun. They are fun. I have one of each, and I could relate to the part of your story when you were talking about um, your older son, Charlie, and how at 3 years old or two, when this all started, he has no idea what's going on. And and yet he had to get dragged from this to that and changing locations. And I just remembered when my son was diagnosed with autism and my daughter had to come to all the appointments and all the things. And so yeah, I could really relate to that.
Mhm.
Because yeah, they don't have a choice, they don't understand, and yet
No, they don't. And the siblings are really the unsung heroes. They
yeah.
have, but again, it's all part of God's plan. There's a reason they're the siblings. God's timing was so perfect because I was already a stay-at-home mom. Charlie wasn't even in preschool yet. So we
Mhm.
literally just picked up and moved to Hershey. And since that year, I never could have done that again. I've always now had a kid in school or something. So,
Mhm.
you know, the timing is always perfect and
Yeah,
just have to say yes. That's all we have to do. So, and I, pray the rosary, the Blessed Mother and the the when Angel Gabriel came to say that she was going to have Jesus, like all we have to do is say yes, and it's the hardest thing in the world to do,
it
but
is. Yeah.
hopefully, we can look to her, as she's crowned the Queen of Heaven and Earth, and say like, well done.
Mhm.
She
Yeah.
did a perfect job.
That's one of the things when I pray, I tell her, I said, please make my yeses more like yours.
Yes, yes,
Because
yeah.
she gave her yes. She's, we in tradition, we say she was what, around 14, 15 years old. So she's considerably younger than what we look at today. And she said yes as a teenage girl, not knowing what was going to happen to her, and knowing that as a single mom at that age, a lot could have happened.
Oh my gosh, it's still
Yeah.
taboo today.
Yeah.
It's 2025 and it's still like if your 14-year-old daughter gets pregnant, it's not happy news.
No.
So
No.
I mean, she
So
really was so brave in
yeah.
in her yes. I don't think she gets a lot of we picture her, I think, as this like sweet, perfect little mom, but she was probably a warrior, like
Hmm.
she had to flee with her child to
Yeah.
Egypt. Like, I mean, she's no joke. No joke.
I've heard a couple people refer to her as wearing combat boots.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
So,
mean, it's
yeah,
like, and mommies come in all shapes and sizes, and we're called to do different things, and
yeah,
um, I think also too, the personality that you got is because God needs that personality to do what he's called you to do.
I
So
agree. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to ask you a couple more things before we wrap up. And the first one is you mentioned that you were a decluttering coach.
yes.
What is a decluttering coach?
So I literally go into people's homes and I remove clutter. Like I help them remove clutter from their homes. And I now do it virtually as well because of Zoom.
Yeah.
I can work virtually with people. So I it's more than just the decluttering. I really help women run their homes efficiently.
Mhm.
And so I have a podcast as well. It's called Pruning to Prosper, and it's Declutter Your Life for Catholic moms. And my goal is to help women declutter their homes and their lives to make room for God, because there are a lot of practical things standing in the way of us saying yes to doing what God has called us to do. And sometimes that's debt. So I help with budgeting. Sometimes it's just getting dinner on the table. So I do meal planning and budgeting and working on routines to run your home smoothly. And but a lot of times it's clutter in the way. So
So
that's
physical clutter, emotional clutter, digital clutter, it's
yes.
all clutter.
Yeah.
So how long have you been doing that?
I started my in-home decluttering 5 years ago, right before COVID. So timing wasn't the greatest on that. But then I started the podcast, I believe, about 3 years ago. So
Oh.
yeah, it's been great. I've loved doing it.
Well, then I'm going to make sure that we have your podcast and your website. Oh, no, that's right. You're working on your website. We talked about that
I
before.
am. Yeah,
Um,
coming soon.
but I'm definitely going to refer people to your podcast. And we'll get that in the show notes so that people can click on that. And then the last thing that I like to ask people is if you have any warrior words for the mom who's listening, who who has a child who is sick.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe she doesn't have the Ronald McDonald House, or maybe she doesn't have, um, good insurance or something. What would you say to the mom who's listening, who's just struggling to say that yes right now?
Well, I think no matter what you're going through, my advice is always pray the rosary. Because, when you become Christian, your life is not automatically easy peasy. If anything, it's probably
Oh,
going to get harder.
yes.
But I do think that when you pray the rosary every day, and I coach right now, I'm doing a 12-week coaching with my audience. And so that's their homework is we first establish the habit of praying the rosary very first thing. Before you reach for the phone and technology, you reach for that rosary. And I think really it's because being Christian doesn't make us immune to issues and hardships, but praying the rosary and having our faith makes it a lot easier to carry that cross. And you never step into the same rosary twice. So if you're praying and it's the Annunciation, you can maybe meditate on, where am I afraid to say yes, God? Show me where, if it's the Visitation, God, bring me a woman that is going to be a good friend. I need a friend to show up, in my life, like the Blessed Mother showed up for Elizabeth. There's so many things, and I think you just have to always look for the good and look for God's blessings in every situation. St. Paul says, in all things, give thanks. And when you're at your lowest points in life, it's very hard to say, oh, thank you, God, for this baby with
Yeah.
cancer. But 16 years later, I can very, very much say, thank you for exactly what we were given, because it has been such a blessing. My faith went to this next level that I would wish upon everybody. It's a peace that transcends human understanding. And so I think to any woman going through something hard, I would say pray the rosary, and be very specific in asking God for what you need. He knows, he loves us more than we love our own children. So if you say, I need $1,000, God, be open to where that might come from. And don't be afraid to ask for help. So there's very practical things sometimes that, you can reach out and ask your church for help or the community for help. But I would just say pray the rosary all the time. Pray without ceasing.
Pray without ceasing. Yes, you
Yeah.
reminded me of that. Rejoice always, pray
Hmm.
without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances.
It's
Yes.
true. It's very true. And there, especially when you have a sick child, no one understands watching a child suffer more than our Blessed Mother. So
Mm.
just turn to her and, just use her strength and offer up your suffering for, salvation of all of us.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Gina. I appreciate your vulnerable story, your bravery, your laughter and your tears,
Thank you.
and your joyful yes.
Thank you. It's nice meeting you. Thanks so much.
It's not easy to be open to God's will. And it's definitely not easy when God asks you to walk through a painful storm. We are being asked to trust without knowing the outcome. But sometimes, if we knew the outcome, we wouldn't be willing to trust. Maybe we'd be more likely to rely on ourselves instead. But honestly, we don't know the outcome there either. So, what makes us think that our way is better than God's? Gina was the second person I've spoken to recently who chose to ask, "What do you want me to do with this, God?" I think that's a really good question to ask. She knew that Teddy was sick, and she knew there was a chance that he wouldn't live long in this world. But she made the conscious decision to trust God's plans for him and for her. And while Teddy's life on this earth was short, his legacy lives on. And speaking of not knowing outcomes, the irony here is that Gina knew one of the likely outcomes of Teddy's cancer. What she didn't know was the long-lasting impact of his short life. People prayed for him who hadn't prayed in a while. People raised money for him and other children walking through a cancer storm. A church community and a college community came together to support Gina's family. And 16 years later, she is still meeting people who prayed for Teddy. He lives on. Well, one of the themes of Gina's story is trusting God's will. But the other theme is prayer. It is the prayer of others for her family. It is also the prayers we pray for ourselves. I know it's something that could be considered cliche, but they are cliche for a reason, and that is prayer changes things. Not always the way we ask or the way we want, but always in accordance with God's will. Those themes intersect. Gina's warrior words encourage us to be prayer warriors. Praying the rosary helps us focus on the life of Jesus. And the life of Jesus was not sunshine and roses, but it is the perfect example of how to walk through storms, trusting in God's will. And not just Jesus's trust, because Jesus is God. But if you look at the life of Jesus, Mary had to trust in God's plan. Joseph had to trust in God's plan. They had storms to walk through. They had to flee their country and they had to go to Egypt, which was not part of their human plan, but it was God's. Just so many instances in the life of Jesus, in the trust in Mary and Joseph to care for Jesus. It's an incredible way to have prayer in your life, is to reflect on the lives of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and how they all trusted in God's plan. So where in your life can you trust more in God's will than in your own? And where can you add a little more prayer in your life? Something to think about this week. So until we meet again, armor up, fight the good fight, seek beauty, and make your words warrior words. God bless.